Hey, I'm Ophi YouTube videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. I'm gonna put a big old trigger warning right on the front of this one. This is a conversation about sexual violence and also about how we talk about sexual violence when those conversations get brought up. Content warning for sexual assault, coercive control, and intimate partner violence in Part 1, and for child sexual abuse and incest in Part 2. You can find details and timestamps in the description below, as well as which chapters to click on if you would prefer not to hear specific details about any of this. While I do not engage in the whole algorithm game of saying substitute words instead of real adult things, I don't think that there's much value to be found in me butterfly pinning down gratuitous details of somebody else's trauma. I'll get into why a bit later in the video. That's to say, we will be talking about it, but it will be more in summary than it will in specifics. If this doesn't feel like a safe time for you to engage with it, though, I encourage you to hold off. I have plenty of other videos about easier subjects that you could watch either after or instead of this one. This video will be here whenever you feel like this is a topic that you can approach. As is said in whatever the title I ended up being for this video, I would like to talk about the allegations against Neil Gaiman. We will be talking about the podcast that broke the allegations throughout the video. It's a pretty big part of the conversation around it I want to comment on, because I, like some people who I've seen catch varying amounts of deserved heat for it online, I have some hang-ups about this podcast, and more specifically about one of the people who presented this podcast. I don't think those criticisms or my hang-ups of the podcast are necessarily helpful for me to present in the same breath as I'm presenting the account that they were given by the victims who gave their testimony in the podcast. So I want to start off very simply here. I believe Neil Gaiman's accusers, both of them. If you don't want to listen to the 4-part podcast from Tortoise, you can read either the article linked below from Rolling Stone, where the allegations are summarized, as is Neil's refutation to them, or you can read somebody else's summary of the podcast, somebody else who had similar hangups that I did about Rachel Johnson and who I think had a pretty firm read on it. I'm not going to be specifically going over every single detail of these allegations for a few reasons, one of which being that I just don't want that to be my job. I don't want to sit here and tell you the gratuitous detail of the worst things that happened to somebody, especially not when those are already on record in her own words. I highly recommend finding a transcript. You can find a transcript easily of the victim's actual testimony, or you could listen to the podcast. I will be telling you things about it that will likely make you not want to listen to it, but you could listen to the podcast. The second reason that I don't want to go blow for blow and give every single detail and butterfly pin all of this down is that I think it misses the point of me saying that I believe them for me to then lay out all of the details as if we're policemen going over evidence. We are not. We don't need to be. This isn't a trial. We are not a jury. This is us believing what seems to be, to me, credible testimony from a victim or not. And I believe the credible testimony from the victim. So instead, what I'm going to do is tell you that you should read that credible testimony, and then I am going to summarize. I'm summarizing these stories from these allegations first, from what the victim said. And then I will summarize the podcast and summarize conversations I am seeing around the podcast. And then we're going to talk about something that happened in very quick succession with this that I think is relevant to the conversation, not just because of the timing, but because of some of the things that it stokes in people who are talking about it, and especially some of the things that it stokes in people who have similar experiences who now feel disregarded and devalued by the way that these conversations go. So we are starting with Neil Gaiman. We are taking a detour through Andrea Skinner's brilliant recent article about her mother, Alice Munro. We are going to talk about a lot of things, and if you're writing a comment about how my introductions are too long and I need to just get to the point, thank you for writing me a comment. Returning viewers likely already know that it is very normal for me to take my time to clarify how and why I'm approaching a subject and why I do that. A lot of people think I'm open to criticism on it, and I like getting comments because it makes more people see my videos. Speaking of which, if you appreciate that I don't play that whole algorithm game of talking around things or giving them cutesy names, and you want to make sure that you see future conversations like this where we all speak like adults, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to me for more conversations like this in the future. I upload pretty often. And I think most people understand why I take my time in the introduction, but, you know, just a peek behind the curtain if anybody's new here. This is not weird for me. It's a hangout vibe. I would feel a lot grosser about what I was doing if I clapped my hands and immediately got into laying out details. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into part 1, the allegations. So I assume that most people who clicked on this video are already at least passingly familiar with who Neil Gaiman is. But in case you're not, Neil is an author. He wrote Coraline and the Sandman comics. He did half of Good Omens with Terry Pratchett, which has the TV show adaptation with David Tennant and Michael Sheen. And Neil Gaiman is, by the account of at least these two women, who again I find to be credible, apparently a sex pest. Now, I want to be clear because even though I will be criticizing the Tortoise podcast and the approach that it took to much of this story, I don't at all think that anybody walking away with the impression from it that Neil Gaiman is a sex pest seems to have been manipulated into believing an untruth or something. I feel like we have plenty of reason to believe these women and their accounts add up to Neil Gaiman being an alleged sex pest. As I've said before, there are two victims. The first accuser is a woman named Scarlett. Scarlett was 22 at the time to Neil Gaiman's 61, and she worked as the nanny to Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer's shared child. From her account, she was a fan of Amanda Palmer first. We're going to discuss Amanda Palmer a bit later in this video. Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer were separated. They were not living together at the time. The arrangement seems to have been that she would have gone to whichever house the child would be at. On her first night at the job at Neil Gaiman's house and left alone with him, he offered to run her a bath, which she accepted, and she says that he nonchalantly joined her in that bath and sexually assaulted her. Again, I'm not butterfly pinning down the specific details of this, not because I do not believe her allegation. I do, and you can read the details in the Rolling Stone article or elsewhere online. After this sexual assault, Scarlett and Neil entered into a relationship for a period of about a month. Scarlett alleges further sexual violence throughout the relationship in a few different instances. Neil eventually left the country, and 10 days after that, Scarlett says she told Amanda Palmer that Neil had made a pass at her. I'm using those words very specifically because they are the ones that we're told Amanda Palmer heard from Scarlett. Neil made a pass at me. Amanda, in response, allegedly said, "I bet he did," and that Scarlett was the 14th fucking woman to come to her about this. I'm seeing this often get extrapolated to mean that Amanda said Neil had assaulted 14 women, but for reasons that I will be unpacking further in the Amanda Palmer section of this video, I truly believe that that figure of 14 was based on women who had told Amanda that Neil Gaiman had made a pass at them, and not so much specifically the assault part. I don't think that that number of 14 is backed up. There are two separate accusers, both of whom are interviewed in the podcast. To my knowledge, again, 14 was said after made a pass on me and not necessarily after, and also this was assault. Because both of the sources who are interviewed in this podcast really minimize a lot of the things that they're saying as they talk about them, something that I think is understandable, especially in the culture we live in and the way we talk about consent and maybe some of the ways the questions were led from the podcast. Obviously, this does not mean that there will not ever be more and that there are not already more, but from the podcast, two women alleged instances of violence from Neil, and a few other women who they spoke to said that they had nothing but positive experiences. We're going to get into more of this later. Somebody not sexually assaulting somebody else is not proof that they did not assault somebody who says that they assaulted them, though. Following Neil leaving the country and their relationship ending, Scarlett and Neil did maintain contact for a while. That contact ceased following Scarlett going to the police to report the assault in 2022. There are lots of details of their contact in the podcast. We're going to get into it. We're going to get into it, and we're going to get into it because I am criticizing the level of what the podcast shared, and not because I am criticizing Scarlett's actions in those WhatsApp messages. Again, a lot of this will make more sense the more information that you have about what I'm saying, so I should get further into it. The second victim is known only by her first initial, K. Kay was a fan as a teenager who met Gaiman at a signing, and then allegedly, as she got older, was invited out to multiple dinners with Gaiman when he would return to the area. Gaiman was in his mid-40s, and she was in her 20s when they entered into a romantic and sexual relationship, during which she says that she was subjected to sex that she neither wanted or enjoyed. She gives a specific report of sexual assault that occurred within their relationship, again, which I believe, and again was Neil allegedly explicitly doing something that was a direct violation of a stated lack of consent. So why do I want to talk about this if I don't want to go into all of the details? This sounds pretty straightforward, right? This is a man who has sexually assaulted women, particularly young women that he was in a relationship with where there was a significant power disparity. Well, as I've already implied, there are some issues with the podcast, and those issues have swelled all the way around into distrusting and disregarding the accounts of the victims themselves. I think I've already made it clear enough that that is not what we're doing here, but I can make it clearer why that's what's happening in the discourse to begin with, so let's talk about this podcast. So this podcast is called Master, the Allegations Against Neil Gaiman, and it is partially hosted by Rachel Johnson, Boris Johnson's sister, like the former prime minister guy, which is weird. She also has a podcast called Difficult Women, so it's not like quite as random as it sounds. Her having that podcast is how she was reached out to about this in the first place by Scarlett and how she began to research. I, like many people, first saw this podcast on Twitter, and the original Twitter thread sharing it was immediately swarmed by TERFs. People who were gleefully pointing out that Neil Gaiman had previously supported trans rights, as if that had any correlation to the accusations that were being levied now. A lot of people, I think, disregarded the allegations because of who is presenting them and who they are being presented against. A handful of people did wade in, though it was already known pretty early into the podcast's release that it seemed to have been put together by transphobes, or at least by somebody that transphobes love and who loves transphobes. And there are a few threads on Twitter that summarize the podcast and what it might have done poorly that got like a lot of traction. And I will say that a couple of these threads did kind of lose some of the nuance of what was presented. And I'm not saying that this podcast was perfect or that that nuance was done particularly well. I will be criticizing it plenty. But it did at least attempt to present some nuance that gets flattened out when the podcast is being retold in tweet format. For example, the entirety of the podcast is very interested in the question of consent within a relationship. It spends quite a lot of time reckoning with that and with what external factors might weigh on somebody consenting when they may not otherwise, or when they may not, in retrospect as an adult, feel like they had the full information that they needed to consent to what they were getting into. And a lot of that discussion is getting left out of recaps in favor of circulating the victim said that they consented, which is both technically true, as said in the podcast in regards to some aspects of the relationship, but also works very well as a neat and easy get out of cancellation card that it should not serve as here. I listened to the 4-episode podcast in its entirety. I don't think that you necessarily need to. Again, I'm not providing a full recap, and you may want to look into a transcript. If you want to sink 4 hours into this, you definitely can listen, and that's the best way to hear directly from the victims. But there is also a lot of narrating and editorializing done in the podcast by Rachel and by some of the experts they have on that can make it at times a pretty frustrating listen. I did say as I was listening to it that it was something that I felt like I really could not get past the TERF stink on, though they do pretty deftly avoid the trans topic entirely. It's while they're blowing really hard on some dog whistles for adjacent arguments that kind of gives it away. And that consent thing is kind of one of those dog whistles a little bit. So, did the victims say that they consented? That was my number one question going in, why I actually wanted to listen to the podcast. The summary threads were all saying, well, the victims said that they consented to everything and that they feel differently about it now. People were calling it a nothing burger. People were saying that there weren't actually allegations of assault, and people were taking each other's word on that because they didn't want to listen to a podcast with TERF stink on it. I did that for you. I did that for you because I love you and because I'm a cisgender lesbian who is not going to be necessarily harmed by wading into TERF rhetoric if I find myself on that side of the internet. But also, in case anybody's here to tell me I'm a hypocrite because I just said that doing conversion therapy for content was bad in my last video, I didn't pay for it. I would not pay for it. But, having listened to all 4 episodes, did the victims say that they consented? Kind of? Like, they did, but as I said before, in the actual context of the story, it is different. Because yes, Kay says, I consented to everything that happened, but I didn't want it. But also, she tells a story that directly contradicts that. An account of a time where she said, do not do this specific thing, and then that specific thing happened against her wishes. So, no, she did not consent to everything. The argument is not that nothing non-consensual happened. That is just also a thing that she said and that they left in the podcast for some reason. And in Scarlett's case, she spoke to Neil about this over text in a conversation that we will speak more about in a moment. And she referred even in that text conversation to their relationship as having begun questionably, but eventually it was undoubtedly consensual. And he didn't ask her what she meant at the time about begun questionably. You know, I kind of assume that it's because he didn't really care. Rather than going beat for beat on the original podcast, I did make an outline as I listened, but for the sake of the video, I have summarized that into a few things that I want to talk about in regards to how they handled this, things that I've seen them get criticism for, things that I personally am criticizing them for, and kind of talk about how fair the criticism itself is. So, number one, I have seen people say that the podcast was paywalled, and this is not true. I think there is a paid app for Tortoise, the little media imprint that put this podcast out, and you can opt to pay for it, but the podcast about the allegations against Neil Gaiman is on podcast apps. I listened to it on Spotify. There are ads baked into the podcast from whoever is distributing it, so not the kind where the runtime cuts out and Spotify is trying to sell you something, but something baked right into the audio of a podcast. Not from the hosts, though. Like, it's ad breaks, but they're not necessarily part... You know, it feels worth clarifying, because when I say there's a bunch of ads, you might be thinking that she was like, well, and this makes me think of Blue Apron, which is not what it was, but there were, like, probably 4 ads in each ad break throughout the episode. And look, I think that's fine. I'm putting a couple of ads on this video because the script is 15 pages long and it took me a while to write, and all I am doing is writing and then filming what is essentially an op-ed. I am not doing actual journalism, which takes resources and time and money to do. Even journalism with an angle to it, which I do think that this podcast was, is journalism. This isn't really like what I mean when I say that most YouTubers aren't making documentaries. This is journalism. I'm not upset that there are ads on it. I would think it was bad if it only existed behind a paywall, but it does not and seems not to have ever at any point. Beyond the ads, though, I am a bit of two minds about this kind of allegation coming out in podcast format. And, okay, look, not just because I know somebody's already frothing to call me a hypocrite in my YouTube comment section for being a YouTube channel that also covers serious topics and saying, did this need to be a podcast? Actually, maybe I shouldn't clarify. I think that's probably pretty good for engagement when I let people get mad at me. But anyway, I don't think that this being rolled out in podcast format is inherently always going to be bad. I think it makes sense that if Rachel's format is already that she works in podcast anyway, that's the framework she would look at telling this story through when somebody reached out to her with their story. So it's not the fact that this story is being told over audio that I'm bothered about, or that there are ads in that audio. It's just something about the framework of this being 4 episodes long when it doesn't truly need to be. Quite a few portions are repeated. I noticed a lot of the clips from the interviews with the victims are used multiple times across episodes. And also, clips from the victims' testimony themselves felt much smaller in runtime compared to the narration from Rachel or Paul, or from other people giving their commentary on the situation, ranging from experts and authors to friends of Scarlett. So I am cool with it being a podcast, but I don't think that podcast needed to be 4 episodes long. I will say, in its defense, all 4 episodes dropped at the same time. It's not like it's something that rolled out once a week with increasing suspense. This has all been available to listen to in its entirety ever since it was released, and very explicitly is said in the very first episode to be meant to listen to in its entirety. It just feels very bloated, and that's because while the arguments that it wants to make should be pretty solid, I mean, I think we're all pretty much in agreement about what it is that Neil Gaiman did wrong here, the podcast gets lost down a few different avenues. So the primary fault that I find with this podcast, the thing that I think is leading the most to victims being disbelieved, and maybe something that people are going to try to, catch me out on for commenting about and say that I'm saying that I think journalists should lie or whatever, I think we saw way too much from the WhatsApp messages between Neil and Scarlett in this podcast. I understand, as someone who is, of course, on the side of the young nanny in a situation like this, that Scarlett was being very honest and also very brave by handing over her message history with Neil, where, as the podcast keeps repeating to us, she appears to be in a happy and consensual relationship with the author. Rather than just allowing us to take Scarlett's word for it, we are instead subjected to word-by-word reads of messages exchanged between Neil and Scarlett, even when they're not particularly very damning for Neil. Not more than knowing that they exist would be, anyway. Mostly what they do is inadvertently poke holes in the testimony that Scarlett is giving about how bad this relationship was to be in. Now, they do try to balance this, again, what I'm saying, where the way that people are summarizing it is not quite accurate to how it actually is in the podcast. A lot of the conversation in the podcast is about how law enforcement has failed Scarlett, specifically on the grounds of these WhatsApp message transcripts that they looked at. Apparently, they were so thoroughly convinced by reading these that no case would hold up in court, so they never even interviewed Neil Gaiman about Scarlett's allegations. I think that there is this idea of, let's present the same evidence that the police didn't find looking into and make it clear why it is a big deal. But I just don't quite think that this podcast managed to do it convincingly enough. Because as I said about them getting lost down different avenues here, showing us all of this WhatsApp evidence isn't even the only digression here that felt really noticeable to me. The podcast spends quite a bit of time speaking about marital rape and how it has only recently been outlawed. And I'm not saying that this is a fully irrelevant thing, given the way that patriarchy affects both that and the outside of marriage sexual violence or rape that we are discussing here. But I am saying that it's not quite the conversation that we're there to have, right? I mean, we're talking about something extramarital, something that was workplace harassment that happened over the course of only a few months. That's not marital rape. And I'm speaking as somebody who gets very upset when I think about the fact that up until 5 years before I was born, there was no legal precedent that marital rape was even a thing. it is sort of a feminist upset talking point, yeah? I'm not entirely sure if that makes sense, but they worked a few of those feminist upset talking points into this. Things that aren't quite as aligned with what we're currently discussing, but that we're kind of just throwing onto the table and mixing together, because what they're about to do, once they get past things that do make sense to talk about in conjunction with intimate partner violence, is just kind of to start to throw a bunch of handfuls of things at the wall. Again, like I said, the WhatsApp is my primary example of that. We see them do that with Scarlett in this relationship where she was the much younger nanny employed by Neil, and she continued to exchange text messages with him after the initial assault and throughout and after the brief relationship they had that followed. We've heard in detail messages from her where she told Neil after the fact, again, things began questionably, but were undoubtedly eventually 100% consensual. And we learn later that Neil, after that conversation, would ask Scarlett to sign an NDA long after both their physical relationship and her employment by him had ended, and that it was backdated all the way back to the initial meeting and assault. So they share these messages and they attempt to undermine the assumption that they know that their audience is going to make when they hear them, that everything was consensual, similar to the soundbite that they repeat multiple times from Kay where she literally says as much. But I think this works so much less well when somebody is giving a blow-by-blow on Twitter of the podcast, because when you're listening to the podcast, it is so repetitive, and every time they bring it up, it feels so tenuously relevant that it's hard to focus on long enough to, agree with them about it. Rather than making what I think is a clearer argument, these two women allege specific instances of sexual assault within a relationship that also featured other things they consented to. An effort is made instead, I think, to sort of weaken the idea that they were at all able to consent to anything within the relationship when they were in their 20s. And look, yeah, age gaps can be tricky business and nasty discourse. I'm not here to say a grown man has any business trying to take a bath with a nanny in her early 20s, or to get into a relationship with a 20-year-old that he knew when she was a teenage fan of his. Clearly, I think that's disgusting. But I think the show is hoping that rather than spaghetti throwing, all of these additional angles that they're adding are going to feel like what they're doing is building a really obvious case about how every possible angle of this interaction between these two was obviously bad and wrong, and Neil should have known that. But they examine it from so many different angles that rather than building up a solid case like they want to, they kind of start to erode what they're saying. And one of those erosions is one that I think is really kicking people into hearing that dog whistle that I mentioned earlier. You know, the show is really extremely proud of this piece of legislation on the books in the UK that says that sex that is even mildly physically painful is unlawful. They use this and a few other pieces of rhetoric I don't entirely agree with to argue, again, the same way that Scarlett's ability to consent within the relationship at all, even to the things that weren't forceful and against her will, is attempted to be weakened, that any consent that somebody gives to sex that is uncomfortable or that causes pain is null and void, and that the other person should know that that is not consent that can be acted on. And you don't have to be into kink or like kink, just like you don't have to be into age gaps or trust men who are into much younger women, but I have an inherent distrust the second that someone thinks that any sex that causes any kind of pain is bad, no matter how much the person receiving the pain wanted it. Not because I'm particularly passionate about kink or because I think that it can't be done unsafely or abusively. It absolutely can, the same way that any kind of sex can. But it's more because, and you might have already gotten here, but I will connect the dots if you haven't already. If sex that hurts is against the law, and gay and queer people have a kind of sex that is historically denigrated and deemed as dirty and unsafe and dangerous, they're going to say no gay sex allowed either with this kind of argument eventually, I feel. It just feels very much like something that, if it is not already an anti-sodomy law on its face, could be interpreted as one very shortly. And I don't trust people who wield that kind of thing, even if they are trying to wield it in a feminist way. I don't trust Boris Johnson's sister. I think it's actually fair and valid to distrust Boris Johnson's sister. I don't think distrusting Boris Johnson's sister, or the way that she approached this podcast, or the way that she handled the victims and their testimony in it, always means that we are distrusting or discrediting the victims. Though I do think a lot of the ways that this podcast has been criticized does discredit the victims. Let's circle into one of my absolute biggest criticisms of this podcast, which is, of course, the Amanda Palmer of it all. Amanda Palmer, described in this podcast nearly every time she comes up as feminist rock star Amanda Palmer, which does at a certain point begin to feel both disconnected from reality and also needlessly mocking. I mean, I think Amanda does call herself a rock star a couple of times in like a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but I think a more fair description of Amanda Palmer would be maybe feminist indie darling, feminist former indie darling, problematic favorite, perhaps. I don't think Amanda Palmer has ever been widely regarded as a feminist rock star. I think she's always been pretty divisive in any scene she's been in, particularly with feminists. As far as the rock star thing goes, Amanda Palmer is a performer. She is one half of a band called the Dresden Dolls, and she also does a lot of solo stuff. She has work under names like Amanda Palmer and the Grand Theft Orchestra. I am planning on doing an entire video mapping out Amanda Palmer's career and as many controversies as feel relevant to it, which will be many, many. But this whole Neil Gaiman thing is not a controversy that feels relevant to her career. And in truth, I did make this video in part because I knew that whenever I did eventually make the Can We Examine Amanda Palmer as an Artist video that I talked about in my Your Fave is Problematic video a few months ago, I knew that the only comments that I would ever get on that video, if I hadn't already spoken about this Neil Gaiman thing, would be people wanting to talk about Neil Gaiman. And I don't think it would be very fair to talk in my video about examining Amanda Palmer as her own person and as an artist to spend a bunch of time talking about her ex-husband. It does, however, feel fair to spend a bunch of time talking about Amanda Palmer in a video about her ex-husband, because the podcast I'm criticizing in this video talks about Amanda quite a lot. And I may be being too generous to Amanda Palmer here. You may especially think that once you see some of the things that I'm planning on criticizing her about in my Amanda Palmer video, but if Scarlett had said that Amanda said, "You are the 14th woman who has come to me about him assaulting them," I would have a lot less sympathy for Amanda here than I currently do. But in the full context of the podcast, with the way that the clips are arranged and what we actually hear Scarlett saying compared to what we are told Scarlett says later, it really sounds like "You're the 14th fucking woman to come to me about this" is about Neil Gaiman making unwanted passes on them. And yes, with Scarlett being their nanny, Amanda's reaction absolutely fucking could have been better. It should have been, "Do you want me to make sure you're never left alone with him again? I'm so sorry. What do you need from me?" But again, from Scarlett's own mouth, we only hear that she told Amanda that Neil made a pass at her, and was told by Amanda, "I bet he did." In the podcast, Rachel Johnson cuts in and tells us that Scarlett later on in the conversation told Amanda everything and heard Amanda pacing through the night. But it then cuts back to the interview with Scarlett, and then the next thing that we hear in terms of actual details that Amanda was given about this, though I do believe that they talked about it because Amanda reached out to a friend of Scarlett's and was like, "Thank you for looking after Scarlett." Scarlett's friend responded to Amanda in a message that is shared in part with the podcast, where she tears into her and outlines these allegations against Neil. We don't hear anything about if Amanda responded to this message or what she said. My gut tells me, without actual evidence, this is a speculation, I think if Amanda had directly responded to that message, we would have probably heard it in the podcast. We do know that Amanda eventually shared at least parts of this message with Neil, because Neil would mention it later in a conversation with Scarlett in that WhatsApp transcript that we have way too much of. But having only heard Scarlett say that she told Amanda that he made a pass at her, I'm willing to believe context clues that tell me that there's a reading of this situation where Amanda Palmer was told after her ex-husband had left the country and their former nanny had had a relationship with him for a month that had ended, and told her about it after it was over. The nanny began with, "Neil made a pass at me," and she said, "I bet he did. You're the 14th fucking woman to tell me that." I really think that she may not truly have understood the depth of what Scarlett was alleging at that time. And I could be giving Amanda Palmer too much credit. I'm very aware of that, but it's just the way that the episode was edited that made me feel this way. I didn't hear Scarlett saying that 14 women was in response to anything other than the "he made a pass at me" phrasing. And Neil and Amanda were, I will remind you, very much divorced by the time Scarlett and Amanda even met each other. It actually was a pretty messy split for a moment there, something that played out across Patreon and Goodreads of all places. I'll link in the description below. There's actually an episode of a podcast that a friend of mine wrote for that is actually about their divorce. And if you want to pause, I am putting screenshots up on screen now to remind you what I am talking about when I say that towards the beginning of the pandemic, Neil Gaiman pretty famously abandoned Amanda and their young child in New Zealand, flouting travel rules and leaving her alone there with the kid. Which I say to mean, I think, as I've said when I got to have some of this conversation in advance with somebody in the comment section on my Your Fave is Problematic video, hi, I think if Amanda Palmer was responsible for what Neil Gaiman did and did not do, she probably would not have been abandoned at the beginning of the pandemic with her small child. And also, even while they were married, the podcast itself acknowledges that they had an open marriage. So, in that context, you're the 14th fucking woman to come to me about this, and this means Neil making a pass at somebody and them not knowing whether or not Amanda was okay with that, suddenly sounds a little bit less sinister on Amanda Palmer's part, right? But that's not the goal of this podcast. They want nothing to be less sinister. And I don't say that because I think that there's some non-sinister read that I want you to have on what Neil did. I say it because they kept telling me how many times they harassed Amanda Palmer and her friends and her former couples therapist for comment for the podcast and didn't get a response, and it just increasingly made me feel a sympathy for Amanda Palmer that I could tell they were not intending to elicit. Amanda Palmer has done plenty of things that are worthy of criticism, and she has received plenty of criticism for things that other people have really not been so heavily hated for. I mean, crowdfunding comes to mind when I say that. But even by the account of these victims who came forward about Neil, Amanda was not the perpetrator in these acts. And despite being divorced, which is pretty fucking separated from the perpetrator of them, she's brought under this umbrella of who we're meant to walk away from the podcast being angry at. I mean, they say Amanda and Neil's partnership boosts his feminist credibility. She divorced him. I think that if she boosted it by marrying him, the divorce unboosts it. This feels more than a little bit unfair. And I want to be clear that I'm saying this to defend Amanda Palmer and not to defend Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman should not have gone anywhere near these women, and it is very troubling that he would have to begin with. But I do not believe, for all of her flaws, that if Amanda Palmer knew that her ex-husband had sexually assaulted 14 women, that she would have not said anything about it. I'm gonna steal my best friend's line here. That would have been a concept album of hers by now, if she did know about this. The closest that we got was a couple of lines in a song that came out this January. I will put them on the screen. I have seen them extrapolated to be tied to that 14 women line, but I think it all still fits well with this generous reading that we can give to Amanda's level of knowledge and agency in this situation. And I don't even say that to mean that I think that you need to be generous to Amanda Palmer in all situations. I don't think it's very feminist to harass women about something that their ex-husband did after they were divorced. I don't think you can really do that and maintain a ton of feminist credibility with me. And to be clear, while Rachel Johnson increasingly lost her credibility with me the more times she called Amanda Palmer a feminist rock star or implied that she should be the keeper of the ex-husband she divorced, Neil also did not gain any credibility with me with his response. So for Neil's response, it is threaded throughout the podcast itself. He outright denies some of the allegations, and he allows other interpretations of some of the others. They say in the podcast that Neil says that the messages from the women prove his point that the relationship they had was consensual, and he cites 50 Shades of Grey as evidence that women like rough sex, which he argues was done only consensually in these relationships. They also say that he alleges that Scarlett was treated in the hospital for a condition that causes false memories, and that they've found no such evidence in their investigation. Now, I've seen some people say that the false memories thing is him being a Scientologist to her, since his father was a Scientologist. Another thing I'm kind of including when I talk about spaghetti throwing, they talk about allegations that were made of his father sexually assaulting people, but it was allegations that were made after he left Scientology, and they kind of also acknowledge that Scientology makes that kind of thing up. Anyway, I don't think that it's Scientology, though. I think we actually already saw another piece of this pattern that Neil is exhibiting here, and if you paused to read those screenshots earlier or remembered what I was saying, you know what I'm talking about, but I will put them back up here. Following Amanda's Patreon-exclusive breakup post that Neil was apparently not aware of until it uploaded, Neil's Goodreads account marked itself as reading a book that was titled Splitting: Protecting Yourself While Divorcing Someone with Borderline or Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Which, he later claimed that he had been the victim of a very specific hack and deleted it. So that's bad, right? Like, it invited speculation about his ex-wife's mental health condition or diagnosis, and also, wow, this is super, super stigmatizing. I also never quite took his word about the whole being hacked thing. My best friend joked that Amanda may have logged it on his account, and that's what he meant by hacked, and I think that might have been possible, but now that I've seen him claiming that Scarlett suffers from a condition that creates false memories, I think maybe this was a playbook he was thinking about throwing at Amanda before they decided to peacefully co-parent. The two seem to be on decent enough terms currently, minus, Amanda singing songs about him, which is probably always part of the deal. Again, they're divorced. Amanda has never made any allegations against Neil. And also, these were not from Neil himself in his response, but there were a few people who were friends of Neil's who spoke to the podcast and gave positive character references of him for sorts, one of which was a woman who is introduced to the audience. Like, she's explained to the audience as a woman who enjoys rough sex in a way that it all just feels weird. The whole podcast feels so weird. As I've already mentioned, a lot of summaries of this show have missed what it's actually attempting to frame around the consent mentioned in their recaps. It takes a nervously said, "I consented to everything that happened to me, but," as law, without listening to the rest of the statements being made by the victim, which in Kay's case very much do include things happening against her consent. And in Scarlett's case, even in the conversation often used as a smoking gun, where she said after Neil had told Scarlett that he was actively trying not to kill himself, from hearing from Amanda that Scarlett was planning to Me Too him, she rushed to assure him that that wasn't the case and that she had said no such thing. It still doesn't really conflict with her initial report or what we're told of how she explained the way that things happened on the night of the initial assault. And also, it just takes a lot of time sometimes for someone to fully unpack the way that they feel about things. So especially in the context of a conversation with their abuser, I don't hold it against somebody if they said, "I would never Me Too you." I don't think that it means that they should never get to tell their story. Obviously, a cleaner, neater victim narrative wouldn't have made that kind of promise, but when you're backed up against a wall, you make promises sometimes, and feeling like you were responsible for somebody who you care about trying not to kill himself can lead you to make a promise. I don't think this is exactly suicide baiting, but I also don't think it's not really suicide baiting. Do you know what I mean? There are a few things that have been really strongly responded to when people are criticizing this podcast. And I think it results in people feeling like they're invalidating what the victims are actually saying, and it is actually a result of flaws of the podcast more so than of somebody necessarily being somebody who would try to be a rape apologist. One of those issues is the framing of the podcast itself. The podcast, as I've said, reuses a lot of the same clips from the interviews with victims, and it's broken up with narration and editorializing from Rachel, who the audience, largely if they're going in distrustful of this because they think it's Turf City, is not going to trust. And then also a lot of experts and friends of Scarlett's who are weighing in on their perceptions of the situation. I guess I just think if you're interviewing somebody who has a credible allegation of sexual assault that they tell you about in detail, it's a strange choice to have one of your introductory voice clips of her be her saying, "I did consent to everything, but I didn't want it." It sets yourself up to have to make a truly impossible argument, justifying that none of her consent mattered, rather than focusing specifically on the other times she did very much tell you about when she said no and her lack of consent was disregarded. We do hear that story of her no not being respected at least twice in the podcast, but it is after hearing her say that she consented to everything even though she didn't want it. And I think a lot of people tuned everything out after hearing "I did consent to everything" because these repetitive arguments that no consent counted because it was sometimes not respected were a lot less effective than Rachel thought they would be once she had peppered in too much "all kink is bad" and "rough sex is illegal." The argument didn't need to be every single piece of this was assault when the argument was strong enough when it was assault happened in this relationship. And when assault happens in a relationship, it irrevocably colors that relationship and everything that happened within it. And though she may have consented at times, she is telling us about times when she did not consent and when that did not matter. It's up there with showing us too much of the WhatsApp, where I feel like there comes a point in interviewing your sources when editing out things that people are going to misinterpret is a little bit more important than keeping your punchiest sound bites. And when that punchy soundbite is somebody disqualifying their own assault, you don't need to leave it in, and you probably shouldn't. I guess that's what's most frustrating about listening to this podcast. I agreed with a bunch of the points they were making, but the way that they were making them was not really ideologically coherent with the rest of my worldview or with the way that I feel victims ought to be safeguarded in these discussions. Rather than attempting to make an argument that these women were incapable of consent at all and that Neil had a duty of care to know that, they should have focused on the actual allegations of assault. And because they spent so much time talking about how so much of this is gray and subjective, they just added too many shades to something that's pretty black and white. And then they, and a lot of people who listened to it, expected most people to focus only on the black and white, and now they're raging at everybody who gets distracted by all of the gray that the podcast itself kept pointing to and hyping up. I don't have any information as of right now about how either of these accusers feel about the way the podcast came out. I guess my hope is that they at least liked it, that my feelings of protectiveness over these women are less founded than they feel to me at the moment. Because I kind of feel like they were thrown to the sharks. With this podcast and with Neil Gaiman's allegation situation specifically, I want to encourage nuance, because I think that you should be able to be critical of the podcast and of the way that they presented the stories, but I also do think a lot of criticisms of it are being dishonest about its contents, and that truly does not get us anywhere. It's a lot easier to accept someone telling you, well, he thought they said yes, they said yes, who thinks they're telling the truth because they read it in a thread, than it is to commit the time and effort to trudging through the biases and weird moments in this podcast to hear the victims' accounts firsthand. But if you're not willing to put that time in, Hear it from me. Their statements that they consented to other things is fully irrelevant to the statement that things happened that they did not consent to. The podcast is trying to make that point, but it fails in a way that I think will lead to a lot of people having a complete misconception of what the actual allegations were. No consent to any individual act carries with it a blanket consent to anything else, especially not to things that happen against an express lack of consent. And we keep making that point by saying that we're assuming that everybody else thinks that marital rape is in fact an implication here. We're assuming that everybody thinks that because this woman consented to one thing, she consented to everything, so we're clarifying that she can have consented and also have been raped, when the issue is not that she was consenting to the things that she is alleging happened. There's some, Dworkin level thought processes happening here, but they're just not fully being carried through, I don't think. By continuing to argue about the consent point the way that they did, though, they got it lost in the noise that there were things that happened against a lack of consent. A podcast that was more selective about which audio clip it used to introduce Kay and did not lean so heavily on her saying she consented to everything may have had people walk away with different perceptions of the victims. Okay, and now for that part 2 that I mentioned earlier about Andrea Skinner and Alice Munro. This video is long, as you may have already noticed, and it doesn't get any less heavy in this part, but I'm still not going to be explicitly detailed. If you prefer not to know the details of what Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea Skinner, has come forward about, you can skip to the next chapter. Timestamps are in the description below. Restating my content warning, this is the bit of the video about child sexual assault and incest. And again, the conversations surrounding that and the art of the people who perpetrated or enabled that abuse. I've never read anything by Alice Munro. I was familiar with her name. I knew of her as a lady novelist. But even when memorials about her pop up in the spring, it wasn't with anywhere near the frequency that I've been seeing people's thoughts and opinions about her pop up over the last few days. That's because, very recently, Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea Skinner, published an article. And I want to talk about a couple of things here, and none of them are particularly about Alice Munro as a writer. So I want to start with her daughter's testimony. This was published in The Star, and it is titled, "My Stepfather Sexually Abused Me When I Was a Child. My mother, Alice Munro, chose to stay with him." The subtitle is, "In the shadow of my mother, a literary icon, my family and I have hidden a secret for decades. It's time to tell my story." So the link most frequently being shared on Twitter is to the main Star website. It's behind a paywall, but in my description below, you can find the archived version that I read, and I highly recommend reading Andrea's account for yourself. In it, she discusses her child sexual abuse, an abuse perpetrated by her stepfather, Gerald Fremlin. Fremlin would admit to this. He would later end up even seeing at least some form of punishment in court after Andrea was much older and outside of his control. This is not a he said, she said situation, and we're going to talk a bit about people's responses to this, and really more so people's responses to this later on in the video, but it does feel worth mentioning that this is not a situation where these are reasonably believable allegations that are just now surfacing and we're making a decision to believe the victim. This is something that happened that was not denied, and that there was a court record regarding all the way back in 2005 when Fremlin pled guilty. Again, I'm not here to litigate specifics. You will need to read Andrea's article for yourself to get the details of how things played out, the way her stepfather attempted to blackmail her. What changed this from being something that I found interesting and valuable to read and share on Twitter, but likely not worth me making a YouTube video about, into something that would become part of what the video I had been working about already on the Neil Gaiman allegations was the conversation I started to see around this on Twitter. I think we're in a time when everybody is really chomping at the bit as soon as something like this comes out to discuss whether or not you can separate art from the artist. Whether you need to immediately feel a wrenching guilt for having liked something that somebody terrible made. And that's an instinct that I think makes a lot of sense here, especially the more into what I see about the themes that people are saying was most explored in Alice Munro's work. I understand how that becomes such a talking point right now. I think something we forget, especially when we are in a demographic that may be sensitive about what's being talked about, is that there always is going to be an angle when we're made into spectators of somebody's grief. There's always going to be a way that somebody's brain connects it to themselves and to the way that they can see the world, the things that they themselves have interacted with, which may have been books by Andrea's mother, which may have been books by Neil Gaiman. And I don't say being made into a spectator of somebody's grief to denigrate what Andrea wrote or the testimony that the women gave to that podcast, to say that they shouldn't make us into spectators of that grief. But I do think that it is human and borderline unavoidable to not have the initial response on some level. If it happens, it's kind of an instinct to say, wow, this kind of sucks for me. And to be clear, as much as I understand having that instinct, I also understand being really frustrated by that framing, especially when you're seeing it over and over and over again. The people who I'm seeing and feeling like are most frustrated with this framing are people who are engaging with what is actually being confronted in Andrea's article. Like I said, these weren't just credible allegations coming forward against her stepfather. This article was, as is implied in the title, an examination of her mother's apathy towards her own pain. Andrea knows that her mother's legacy is going to be part of this conversation. That seems to be why she wanted to have this conversation. There's a bookstore that carries her mother's name that was previously run by her stepfather and abuser. And they made a statement in support of her and also are still selling books. The family doesn't seem to want all of Alice's books pulled from publication. It seems to want this to be part of that legacy. So in a way, even though we may feel as if people are centering themselves when they're saying this really sucks because of how I felt about this book, they are still engaging with what's being asked of them with what they're reading. As I've already mentioned, Fremlin was charged long after Andrea was out of his control. Her mother was aware of it well after it happened, but before anything came to light about it, and her mother claimed to have simply been told about this too late. Quoting the article here for the excuses that she gave to her daughter for why she chose this stepfather over her own child. She loved him too much, and that our misogynistic culture was to blame if I expected her to deny her own needs, sacrifice for her children, and make up for the failings of men. She was adamant that whatever had happened was between me and my stepfather. It had nothing to do with her. Andrea was estranged from her siblings for years, but they eventually came back together. And this article is written from a place that does feel genuinely healed to me, but also that wants desperately to reckon with a secrecy that is commonplace but was exasperated by her mother's fame. As she concludes, "My mother's fame meant that the secrecy spread far beyond the family. Many influential people came to know something of my story, yet continued to support and add to a narrative they knew was false. It seemed as if no one believed the truth should ever be told, that it never would be told, certainly not on a scale that matched the lie, until now." There's a reason that I earlier referred to this as a pit stop in our conversation rather than something that I am actively contrasting with the Tortoise podcast. And that is because the clear purpose of these two pieces of work feel very different in effect, even though on their surface they seem like they would be attempting to do similarly, wanting to open up conversations about sexual violence that is usually for one reason or another kept in silence or secrecy. Andrea, the victim herself, and with the help of somebody else who was a journalist, wrote a piece that is beautiful and that has a clear intention, to reckon with the effect that this, in conjunction with her mother's legacy, has had on her life, to show a really exasperated example of something that happens in varyingly large scales all over the country, all over the world. Tortoise, on the other hand, made a piece that attempts to open up a conversation that it wasn't quite skilled enough to control. And at a certain point, that isn't the fault of the journalist. Like, if Andrea's piece was misinterpreted or painted as a hit piece to take down her mother's legacy or something, I would say that that's not at all Andrea's fault. But I can't offer quite as much confidence to the podcast about Neil Gaiman. I can't say that any misinterpretations that come for it aren't a shortcoming of the work itself when the misinterpretations were so hard for me to set aside. At a certain point, that's just interpreting. As I've mentioned earlier, I've seen a lot of discourse happening on Twitter about how to disconnect somebody's work from learning about something like this, in both the Neil Gaiman and the Alice Munro cases. If you even could disconnect someone's work from this, how someone who wrote about women with such empathy and compassion could show so little for her own daughter. I say that specifically about Alice more so than I do about Neil. I haven't read any Neil Gaiman books either, but I did realize as I was talking about this that nobody who's ever told me to read a Neil Gaiman book has ever told me to do that because he writes women well. I mean, that's the kind of compliment that people used to even give to Joss Whedon, and I've never heard anybody say it about Neil Gaiman. I know he wrote that one episode of Doctor Who where the TARDIS comes to life to be a quirky lady. I've seen that. I think he wrote a couple episodes of Doctor Who. Anyway, my point is, if you enjoyed any universe that Neil Gaiman wrote, if you still find comfort or value in something that was created by somebody who did something that you think is horrible, that's okay. Everyone is capable of doing things that are awful and monstrous, and as tricky and upsetting and devastating of a lesson as it is to learn again and again, you are only really less likely to be rocked by these kind of things the less you let yourself imagine that only people who always behave in the ways that you most wish them to could ever make something that you would like. So again, unlike that tortoise article and the debunking that we have seen happening in Twitter threads, however misguided it is, Andrea's story, laid out the way it is and with the amount of evidence that it presents, does not really lend itself to debunking or for much in it to be used to defend her mother. Alice Munro was a woman who had social capital, financial means, a career, notoriety. She doesn't seem to have been abused by Fremlin. At a certain point, the question is less, how could she have not done anything about this, and more, what do we do when someone we admired was complicit in their child's abuse and never made any moves to amend that, even when they were made explicitly aware of it later? And neither of those are questions that we can really answer. Joyce Carol Oates entered the chat, though. Joyce Carol Oates, a novelist and quite inflammatory Twitter user, hopped on to do what I kind of in my gut suspected would happen as soon as I saw this headline. A circling of the wagons around Alice. Crucially, this was before Joyce read the article, though even after she read the article, her opinions were, at times, entirely unsourced and random. I think if there hadn't been a guilty plea, there would be much more attempts being made along these lines to exonerate any guilt that Alice may have had for being married to this man. But Joyce's comment, which also included her saying that she had not read the article and wouldn't have a comment if she did, immediately before her comment, which was just to mostly try to draw a line between this real-world situation and Munro's writing, and then to say that these distressing revelations shouldn't revise our enjoyment of that writing. But she also said, and I don't really know where this one's coming from, she said that many/most/all women would leave a man if he abused an animal or a child. And that really bothered me. Like, tried to start Twitter beef with Joyce Carol Oates level bothered me because what is she talking about? Like, genuinely, I don't know what that means. No, they wouldn't. They would not all leave a man, and for several reasons. While every woman should and can leave an abusive man, it's weird and sourced from nowhere to say that every single one would, because they don't. Many of them are killed before they do, or they're brainwashed into not even attempting to leave, into accepting every little escalation of violence until that isn't the breaking point that someone who has never been in that kind of relationship could imagine. I don't really understand why Joyce would say this, except that I kind of do. I think it's this myth of, like, unflinching maternal instinct. This idea that a woman who is slowly boiling inside the frog pot wouldn't notice when it's just her, but as soon as there's a baby or a dog in there with her, she would jump out. But that's not how domestic abuse works. And to say that all women would leave an abusive man treats victims of domestic abuse in a very strange way. Unfortunately, in the case of Alice Munro, who does not seem by accounts to have been in an abusive relationship, Her not leaving her husband when she learned what he had done is not at all strange. It's devastating, it is a betrayal of her daughter, but it is not strange or unusual. It's what happens. Excuses are made, monsters are forgiven, daughters are expected to suck it up, or they're left to heal on their own without familiar support. And Alice isn't even truly wrong in what she would guilt her daughter with when she would blame this on the patriarchy. Maybe it is an effective patriarchy that Alice felt so like she needed to remain married or have a man. Maybe she felt less legitimate as a woman without a husband, or maybe she had financial gain from being an author with a bookseller husband, though I doubt that it would have been in that order. Maybe she felt like a divorce would have been a more public failure, and that's why she publicly lied and said that all 3 of her children were on good terms with her, even when she was estranged from her daughter. But identifying that shit, knowing that the patriarchy is hurting you, is step 0.01. And if you didn't do anything to make the way that the patriarchy is hurting you not hurt your child, you failed. She used feminist rhetoric against her daughter in a way that really breaks my heart to think about. I do think that it is still fine to enjoy Alice Munro's work if it was impactful to you, just like it's still fine to have a soft spot for whichever Neil Gaiman world you were most sad to consider losing when you saw a headline about him being a sex pest. And while I get people being upset when that's someone's initial response, I think there maybe also just isn't really ever a better time that comes up to reckon with how to disconnect somebody's legacy from what they're complicit in. Especially in the case of Alice Munro, with this article coming out so shortly after her death. Maybe if this revelation from Andrea had come out while her mother was still alive, and people were saying, let's all read Alice's books and see what the connections are, I would say let's maybe wait and hold off until she's gone, the way that I land on with J.K. Rowling and not wanting to pay for anything of her books while she's still alive. But I do think it is kind of intentional with the way that the article was written that people who were impacted by this Nobel Prize winning author's work now have to contend with what Andrea contended with for so much of her life. I don't feel, as long as the way that we're talking about that doesn't erase Andrea and what she's told us, as if it is inherently disrespectful to join her in that grappling. I will say I think group chats are a great place to work through your feelings of personal frustration and disappointments about developments where your support of the foremost and similar victims is going to be more useful to talk about than your outrage is. But I also don't think that, saying that this is the first time you've ever related to the what if you could separate one person's art from the artist question is inherently deserving of scorn either. I guess I just wanted to say that I think that there's room for all of this as long as the discussions themselves are nuanced and concerned about the victims and not just concerned with whoever is getting the best grade in either believing them or poking their stories apart. I also think Joyce might have gotten smacked down hard enough that nobody else is going to try to preserve Munro's legacy as a literary woman as something separate from her legacy as an agent of her husband's abuse against her child, but in case the discourse shifts and more people circle wagons, I do think that a full defense of Munro is the only opinion here that's truly pathetically bad. And I think unlike the Gaiman podcast, there's not even an easy path given to take to get to a defense of her. I'd love to know what you think of either of these pieces of the podcast, if you've listened to it, or if you've come away with different conceptions from this podcast from the way other people summarized it. I would love to know what you think. I still very liberally comment block, so if you make me uncomfortable or you say things that are really mean or triggering to victims of assault, I will not have to deal with seeing your comments on the channel anymore. I've put some resources below as well as all of my sources, like always. I'd love to know what you think. I understand a lot of people might think that it is hypocritical of me to come out against Alice Munro and not against Amanda Palmer, and I will remind you again, the entire issue is that Alice Munro did not divorce her husband, and Amanda Palmer did. Amanda Palmer also responded to Joyce's tweet and told her that she should probably read the article first and revise, and she got smacked down for that. I otherwise enjoyed the article that I linked to that I mentioned at the beginning, but I also don't like that that person who wrote that is also demanding answers from Amanda Palmer. I don't think that we are owed answers from Amanda Palmer regarding her husband's assault of victims who have told their own story. I also don't think that a podcast that may have used those stories manipulatively is unworthy of criticism, even if we don't want to criticize the stories of the victims themselves. And I hope that I've done that effectively here today. If you'd like more videos from me, I do have a Patreon. I upload extra videos there every month. I also have a Ko-fi, and there is currently a GoFundMe situation going on you can read about in the description if you're interested in helping me out financially. Thank you so much to everybody who already has, to all of my Patreon friends, to everybody who has sent me a Ko-fi, and to everybody who has liked, commented on, shared my videos. There's almost 3,000 of us in the Nuance Corner. That's awesome. So much further than I thought that we would be by now when I started back in December. I will be back to talk about something else very soon, and hopefully the next video will not be a big old bummer. Maybe check out one of my other videos if you're looking for something more lighthearted. Bye.